Hello and welcome to the first episode of Archaeal History Revisited. In this episode, we will be revisiting plums, their history and domestication. Plums are a diverse group of cultivated species. The most common ones cultivated are Japanese plums and European plums, although there's still a few American varieties, and in more recent years, hybridization between Japanese and American plums has become more common. European plums and Japanese plums can come in many different forms, each with their own name, such as plums, prunes, bull laces, damsons, date plums, green gages, mirabelles, cherry plums, egg plums, and sloes. In modern times, plums refer to eating plums, while prunes refer to plums that are used for processing, such as canning and confectionaries, or sometimes even brewing. The three most important plums in economic terms include Prunus domestica, or the European plum, Prunus salicina, also known as the Japanese plum, and Prunus simoni. Now on to some botanical history. Now on to the botanical history of plums, starting with European plums. Most European plums are diploid in nature, but the sloe is a tetraploid, and there's various populations of Prunus spinosa, also known as the sloe, and the Prunus cercifera, also known as the cherry plum, that have different levels of ploidy within their genomes. The domesticated form of the European plum is a hexaploid in nature. There are two interesting species of plum in Europe. The first is called the sloe, and the second is called the mock apricot, or Prunus cocomilla. The former is found all across Europe, North Africa, and northern Turkey. This species has at least 4 subspecies, with pollen similar to the European plum. The mock apricot is found in the Balkans, Italy, and the mountains near Turkey. It is speculated that one type of plum that was commonly grown back in the days was a hybrid between both species. Now on to a very interesting species of plum called the cherry plum, also known as Prunus cercifera. The fruit of this plum tree is less than 2.5 centimeters. It is also cherry-shaped, with a plum-like flavor. The fruit have been dried for centuries in the Tian Shan Mountains, and are commonly found in the Balkans and Caucasian regions. This plum has been used for rootstock purposes, as well as crossbreeding with other plum species like the Japanese plum. Among the cultivated European plums, there's 2 species commonly used, Prunus domestica and Prunus instata. Based on current genetic tests, it's likely that the cultivated plums are crossbreeds between cherry plums and sloes. This is made even more complex by the fact that a sloe may be a crossbreed between a cherry plum and something else, or a mutated form of a tetraploid cherry plum. Japanese plums were initially cultivated in China. This species is known as Prunus salicina. They were then brought over to Japan for further cultivation and breeding. Now on to archaeobotany. Now on to the archaeobotany. Researchers have found plum seed remnants in Neolithic sites that are 6,000 years old. This includes damsons and German sites. Since damsons are not native to Germany, it's likely that these were cultivated in orchards. Prunus domestica, or the common plum, was likely introduced to Europe via Romans because, in Europe, the oldest plum seeds we have found are found in areas occupied by Roman occupation. And these seeds have also been dated to the Roman Empire age as well. A further increase in the amount of different plum varieties occurred in the Middle Ages, as represented by an increase in seeds found in different sites. This occurred in Poland. There is also a German plum site where green-gauged plum types that resemble the plums of the 11th and 12th century were found on these sites. Now on to plum history in Greece and Rome. Different Greek and Roman writers wrote about plums in different works. The historian Dr. Cyrano interpreted the plums mentioned by Herodotus and Xenophon as being cherry plums. This made sense since the Scythians and Armenians, both neighbors of the Roman Empire and Greek Empire, lived in areas where cherry plums are found. The first officially known mention of European plums was by Archaeolus in the 7th century. Later on, Virgil mentioned that sloes were used as rootstocks for many different types of plums. Even later in the 1st century, Lucius Junius Moderatus described many plums, including mirabelles and damsons. The former was portrayed in different types of paintings in ancient Rome. There were no examples of plums in Pompeii, indicating that plum culture has really big beginnings in Rome, and as such, the beginnings of plum culture in Western Europe. Now on to Japanese plums and their history. Japanese plums came from China and were moved into Japan early on. They have found plum pits that date back to 300 BC, and plums are mentioned in books dated back to 500 BC. Although it's later found that plums also is used as a word to refer to a plum-like species called ume, and although there's some superficial resemblance to plums, is in fact related to apricots. Plums and apricots were primarily used in drying in ancient Japan. Prunus salicina was one of the common Japanese plums, and the main ancestor to many American plums. Now on to European plums. In Europe, plums have their history shaped by Charlemagne, a French king in ancient times. In the 9th century AD, Charlemagne used Islamic plant garden lists in his considerations on what plants should be grown and what should not be grown. Plums were listed on the list of plants that must be grown. These plums were imported to all parts of Europe. At that time, it was required by law that the gardener of an abbey must provide said abbey with plums and lots of it. Even still, several native plums and European plum cultivars, like bull laces and sloes, were still in use by citizenry, alongside wild plums. In the 1400s and 1500s, different horticulturists and landscapers were improving the processing of different types of plums, as well as arguing about which plum cultivar group was the best cultivar group, and how to create superior orchards for royal gardens. In the 1800s, Gervais Cole bred the world-famous Cole Golden Drop, an heirloom plum that's still grown today, due to the fact this can store in winter. Now on to the history of American plums. American plums are unique as they have multiple origins and were bred multiple times, and we will cover 3 of these groups. In the 19th century, the first cultivar of an American species of plum was made. From the species Prunus hortulana, a cultivar called Minor was bred. Later cultivars from that same stock, such as Wild Goose, were bred later on. Later on, a native plum/cherry plum hybrid was bred and it was called Mariana. This cultivar was used as a rootstock later on. By this point, 50 cultivars bred from different types of American plum were brought into being and sold in cultivation. In later years, A.L. Bruce, the famous plum breeder of that time, began crossbreeding native stock, specifically the Chickadee plum, with Japanese plums. Although this hybrid had sterile pollen, it still made a good plum. In a different setting, plums were being bred independently from European stock. as many European plums were being collected and grown, especially by several of the founding fathers like Thomas Jefferson. Later on in this part of the time period, William Prince bred many different types of plums, specifically gauge, and ran a nursery where he promoted the heck out of plums. In California, Prunus subcordata was also cultivated as a new source of cultivars in California. Later on, Luther Burbank began crossbreeding all forms of species available together to make different plum varieties, although the Japanese plum was the main parent used for its crossbreeding process. Now on to the origins of many different heirloom cultivars and cultivar groups of plum. Now on to the origins of different cultivars. The first cultivar we'll cover the origin of is Prunus salicina, or the Japanese plum. The Japanese plum was brought from Asia to Japan, and from there many cultivars were bred. Luther Burbank bred many California Japanese plums via crossbreeding Japanese plums of other species, such as American species and other Asian species. The common garden plums were bred from Prunus domestica and Prunus instata in Turkey and Europe, respectively. Gauges were speculated to have come from the Trans-Caucasian region. This is due to finding plums of similar quality in that area. Another speculated that gauges are descended from the cultivar veronica. This was later disproved, leaving the direct line of ancestry unknown. Yellow egg plums were likely bred from Prunus instata, alongside damsons, bull laces, mirabelles, and St. Julian plums. That covers everything for this video. Stay tuned for the next episode of Agri History Revisited. Stay lit, fam.